It's not going to be easy. The challenge, though, is what the economics tells us, is that trying to bring down temperature just by cutting energy use is not likely to work. It's likely to be extraordinarily expensive. And that, if it's extraordinarily expensive, you're not going to get the political support for it. If you don't have the political support for it, you won't follow it consistently. If you don't follow it consistently, you won't get any results at all. Which means you're likely to find yourself in mid-century with no program at all, as opposed to one that tries to emphasize adaptation and looking ahead and finding the ways to deal with these. In many ways, it seems like an unsatisfactory approach, but it's probably the most effective one when it comes to an issue like this, where the uncertainties are huge. I think what's critically important is to try to assess where we think the long-term result is, because we're not talking about catastrophic warming. We have far more opportunities to deal with it than if we think it's catastrophic. And I think the best evidence is it's not likely to be catastrophic. Other issues out there, we get much the same kind of analysis. Population growth is one. Another one has long been kind of, folks, talking about catastrophe. You go back to Thomas Malthus, famous economist back in the 1800s. Kind of following in his footsteps is the man Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University, who made his name predicting millions of people would die of starvation in the third world. Utterly incorrect, nevertheless wrote books and became quite famous making these kind of predictions. What we find in population is that people are the ultimate resource. People, in fact, are resourceful. So if people exist in systems that allow them to be entrepreneurial and to create wealth, that they create far more than they consume. And at the same time, we see that fertility rates are falling. The United Nations estimated back in 1992 that the population was likely to top out at about 11.6 billion people. By 1998, it was down to 11 billion. Now the estimates are we're probably going to top out around 8 to 9 billion because fertility rates are falling. In the developed world, countries are shrinking. Many European countries are shrinking. Russia is shrinking. Japan, shrinking, aging population. China, because of its one-child policy, has extraordinary problems of kind of maldistribution in terms of both gender ratios as well as a rapidly aging population. And we're finding in the many third-world countries that fertility coming down very quickly because of the good news that babies now live. That when you once had to have a lot of kids to hope to have one or two survive into whether you were elderly, now these children survive. And because they're surviving, families in these areas are bringing down the number of children that they have. So the critical thing is, do you have societies in which people can be productive? If you look around the world, population and population density tell you nothing about productivity of countries. We typically think of the third world being packed, but in fact, developed countries, whether it be Denmark and others, Britain, far more dense actually than countries like Thailand and others. What you find is the density is actually highest in many industrialized states. Density tells you very little. A very interesting example of why prices are critically important in terms of adaptation and kind of why the importance of a market system is prices are signals. So you want to have resources priced at a market price. You want environmental issues in terms of kind of disposal and in terms of protecting the environment priced at a market price. Because that affects resource use. It signals people. Higher resource prices mean you use it more carefully. You find more. You find new ways. You adapt. Back in 1990, Julian Simon, an economist, and Paul Ehrlich, I mentioned, one of the great catastrophe guys on population, said, let's have a bet. What resource use will be. That if we think in the future resources are going to be more scarce, the price should go up. So Ehrlich is arguing in a future world prices will go up. There's a thing called the Club of Rome report back in the late 70s that predicted we'd run out of gold, run out of oil, all sorts of things. The idea is we have a higher population, all this stuff gets consumed. Prices should rise rapidly. Julian Simon, who was known as he talked about the human being being the ultimate resource. He said, no, prices will fall. They'll be relatively more abundant. Actually, they made the bet in 1980. They chose a basket of resources, and they said, in 10 years we will sit down and we'll check the prices, adjust them for inflation. If prices have gone up, then Simon owes Ehrlich, because Ehrlich was right. They're relatively more scarce. If prices fall, Ehrlich owes Simon, because that shows the resources are relatively more abundant. Well, in 1990, they totaled them up, and they found even without adjusting for inflation, Simon had won. The basket price fell to despite inflation, that he'd been proved right. That basically, relatively speaking, resources become more abundant. We're finding more of them, we're using them more efficiently, we're finding substitutes. All of these things were happening in the course of a decade that made us basically have essentially more resources rather than fewer. So I think it shows the importance of trade-offs. In an issue like population, you can't just look at people as being a cost, but they're also a benefit. And the good news is, if you price things that people are paying, what we see is people adjust their behavior. We're seeing fertility rates going down naturally without having to have coercive measures. I think the challenge for us on these issues is what we really want is a question of balance. On any of these environmental issues, good research matters, science matters, but we need mechanisms that help us choose amongst competing objectives and look, within competing objectives to find the best strategy, the best means to achieve a given end. And what happens if you treat environmental issues as kind of beyond any kind of economic analysis, as being kind of moral purity or absolutes, you lose any sense of balance. You lose the ability to try to make trade-offs. And those trade-offs are very important because those trade-offs very often are very important in terms of the environmental results that you get. A few years ago, the EPA closed down a number of wells in California because they had trichloroethylene in them, which is a carcinogen. Well, people had to go from the water in the wells to tap water, which had natural carcinogens like chlorine in higher concentrations. Now, neither was likely to give you cancer, but in a relative risk sense, the EPA was making people worse off because it was focusing on the wrong things. It wasn't giving you a sense of what's relatively more important here, because that's really your focus. You have to choose between these, which one is relatively better. Long controversy that really, I suspect, predates most of you is the question of polystyrene burger clamshell. For years, if I go to McDonald's, it's an oil-based kind of clamshell to hold it in. It was very good for holding the temperature. But they weren't recyclable. And so environmental groups launched very strong campaigns against all the burger chains. We want cardboard. Don't give us this oil-based stuff. Now, they actually went to work in trying to find ways where they could actually recycle it and kind of essentially turn it back into oil. And they were making progress on that. But at some point, all of the burger chains finally decided, we're just getting beaten over the head on this stuff. It's not worth it. Gave it up. Go to cardboard. Well, the problem is recyclability is only one measure of only one environmental standard. It turns out if you compare these two, you found that the polystyrene one, the oil-based, generated less pollution when you made it, and you had to use less energy to make it. So the question is, which is better? This one you can recycle, this one generates less pollution and uses less energy. Well, that's where prices are very useful, because prices allow you to compare. I mean, who knows which is better? I don't know. What's the more important standard? Use less energy or recycle? I don't know. But prices help you make a decision like that. We probably got bad results. We probably ended up with the less environmentally efficient one because we focused, in a sense, as a matter of faith on one measurement, recycling, as opposed to these other measurements that, in fact, this other one gives us. Question of multi-use of land is, I think, another important one. ANWR, the Arctic Natural Wildlife Reserve, refuge up in Alaska, major point of confrontation. And what you do is, the problem with federal land is it's winner take all. One side says develop it, the other side says, keep it pristine. Because neither side gains the benefit of the other. I mean, if you're an oil company, you don't get any benefit if it's kept pristine. If you're an environmental group, you don't get any benefit if it's developed. So it's winner take all. It's just you get one side or the other. What's interesting is if you look at what environmental groups do with their own land. For 50 years, the Audubon Society ran the Paul J. Rainey Reserve in Louisiana. Now, it also had fairly substantial deposits of natural gas and oil. And they developed it because they understood that if you get the revenue from it, it allows you to advance your environmental ends. Now, it was carefully controlled development.